Once the greatest power a man could possess was the ability to think. Today that power is dying. We live in an age where information is abundant, yet wisdom has vanished, where people shout louder but understand less. The question is not whether humanity is becoming stupid. The question is why we are choosing stupidity over thought. In this lesson, I will reveal why critical thinking is disappearing, how the crowd has become its own tyrant, and how this rise of collective stupidity serves those who rule behind the curtain. You think you are free because you can speak your mind. But tell me, when was the last time your mind was truly your own? They say knowledge is power. But I tell you this, knowledge without thought is nothing but noise. You see, the true power of a man lies not in what he knows, but in how he reasons. And that power, the ability to think independently, is dying faster than empires ever did. Once men were forged in the fire of uncertainty. They doubted, they questioned, they challenged every voice of authority that dared to claim truth. They wrestled with their own thoughts, even when those thoughts frightened them. That struggle was the birthplace of wisdom, the foundation of progress, the spark that kept tyranny trembling in its sleep. But today, that struggle has been replaced by comfort. Comfort in belonging, in agreement, in the illusion of knowledge. The modern man no longer desires to think. He only wishes to belong. The death of individual reason does not arrive with chains or censorship. It arrives with applause. It comes wrapped in validation, approval, and acceptance. People no longer fear ignorance. They fear being different. They will silence their own thoughts to be in harmony with the collective voice. And thus, they are ruled, not by kings, but by consensus. When a society begins to worship agreement more than truth, it kills the very essence of intelligence. You see, it's easier to be a part of the herd than to be the shepherd of your own mind. Thinking is dangerous, exhausting, and often lonely. It isolates you from the crowd. It makes you see the illusions that others desperately cling to. And so, most people surrender this burden. They trade their reason for belonging. Observe the modern crowd. They chant, they argue. They post their thoughts in the open square of the digital world. They call it expression. But in truth, it is repetition. Every opinion sounds like an echo of another. Every conviction is borrowed. Every outrage is rehearsed. They believe they are free because they speak loudly. Yet their words are not born from reflection, but from imitation. They wear their opinions like uniforms, terrified to remove them lest they stand naked before the truth. When I studied men of power, I learned one law above all others. He who commands the mind of the crowd does not need to conquer their bodies. Control the thought, and you control the man. Control the man, and you control the world. And what better way to control the mind than to make thinking a crime and agreement a virtue? Modern rulers have learned this art well. They no longer suppress questions with force. They dissolve them with noise. They flood the mind with distractions, drown reflection in entertainment, and fill the air with so much information that no one has the strength to sift truth from illusion. The man who might once have questioned now simply scrolls, and in his endless scrolling, his reason withers like an unused muscle. But here lies the cunning of this decay. People do not realize they are losing their ability to think. The death of reason is quiet. It disguises itself as progress, as convenience, as modernity. Why think? The crowd whispers, when others have already thought for you. And thus, reason becomes outsourced. People consume opinions the way they consume food, quickly, thoughtlessly, and in excess. The tragedy of this age is not ignorance. It is the illusion of wisdom. Every man believes himself informed, yet few have ever truly examined a single idea. The world rewards confidence, not clarity. And so the loudest voices rise to power while the clearest minds are ignored. The marketplace of thought has become a carnival of vanity, where truth is no longer profitable and deception is the most valuable currency. When the mind becomes addicted to agreement, it can no longer discern truth from popularity. The people begin to mistake the common for the correct. What most believe becomes what must be right, and thus the crowd becomes its own tyrant. You see, in my time, a ruler had to fear the rebellion of free thinkers. But in your time no such danger exists, for the people police their own minds. They punish anyone who questions, they exile anyone who doubts. They do the work of tyranny willingly, with pride, and call it morality. Look closely, and you'll see how this corruption begins early. The child is taught what to think, not how to think. The student learns to memorize conclusions, not to reach them. The young man learns to repeat ideas, not to challenge them. By the time he becomes an adult, his mind is no longer his own. It is a mirror reflecting the beliefs of the age, and in that reflection, individuality dies. The death of individual reason is not the collapse of intelligence. It is the surrender of it. It is when a man stops asking, why, and begins to ask only, who agrees with me? It is when logic gives way to loyalty, and truth bends beneath the weight of belonging. In such a world, deception becomes effortless, because no one wants to question what everyone seems to believe. I once wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. But today, I would add, it is better to think and be hated than to agree and be adored, because a mind that surrenders to the crowd may gain applause, but it loses itself. The death of individual reason begins not with ignorance, but with cowardice. The coward fears the loneliness of thought. He fears being mocked, isolated, or misunderstood, so he hides behind the safety of the majority. And slowly he forgets how to think for himself. The intellect becomes ornamental, used only to defend opinions already chosen for him. He speaks of truth, but what he really seeks is comfort. And when millions of such minds gather together, they form a new empire, an empire of obedience disguised as enlightenment. It is not ruled by a tyrant on a throne, but by the collective will of those too afraid to stand apart. And in that empire, the greatest heresy is not to be wrong. It is to be different. The death of reason, then, is not a tragedy of the mind, but of the spirit. It is when the soul of man chooses peace over truth, and silence over thought. It is when the flame of intellect still burns, but no one dares to look at its light, for fear of what it may reveal. If the death of reason is the disease, then emotion is the poison that quickens its decay. In every age, rulers have known one truth. Men are not governed by facts, but by feelings. They may pretend to value truth, but in the end, it is their emotions that command them. The wisest tyrant is not he who forbids thought, but he who manipulates emotion so masterfully that the people no longer desire to think at all. Once, power belonged to those who could reason, who could debate and persuade with intellect and discipline. But now, power belongs to those who can provoke. In your modern world, emotion has dethroned logic. The heart has seized the crown from the mind. You see it everywhere, in politics, in culture, in the very way you communicate. Outrage spreads faster than truth, fear travels swifter than reason, and envy burns brighter than understanding. It is no longer necessary to prove anything. It is only necessary to make people feel something. Emotion is the new god of your civilization, and its temples are the screens that you stare into. Every day, you kneel before them, offering your attention, your most valuable currency. To those who know how to stir your passions, the rulers of your age are not philosophers or thinkers, but performers. They do not guide thought, they ignite emotion. They do not lead men toward wisdom. They herd them through anger, pride, and fear. And yet, the people believe themselves free. They confuse emotional indulgence with freedom of thought. They say, "I speak from the heart," as if passion were a substitute for reason. They call their outrage justice, their bitterness truth, their feelings morality. In this way, emotion becomes not a servant of truth, but its assassin. You must understand, emotion was never meant to rule. It was meant to obey. It was meant to give life to reason, not to bury it. When reason governed, emotion provided the fire that moved men to act. But when emotion governs, reason becomes a chained prisoner, forced to justify whatever madness the heart desires. Once that balance is broken, civilization begins to rot from within. Consider the way men now argue. They do not seek understanding, they seek victory. They do not listen, they react. To question someone's belief is to attack their identity, because they no longer separate emotion from idea. Their opinions have become their pride, their fear, their sense of belonging. So when you challenge them, they do not defend their logic, they defend their self-worth. The battlefield of ideas has become a theater of feelings, where the loudest cry and the deepest outrage win the day. And who benefits from this? The rulers. Those who control the mechanisms of emotion, the storytellers, the media, the platforms, the politicians. They have discovered the secret of effortless power. They no longer need to command the body when they can inflame the heart. They no longer need to silence reason when they can drown it beneath waves of emotional chaos. By keeping the people in a state of constant reaction, they keep them weak, predictable, and dependent. A mind that burns with emotion cannot see clearly, and a people that cannot see clearly cannot resist control. In your time, truth is no longer decided by evidence, but by emotionally satisfying narratives. A lie that comforts is believed more quickly than a truth that disturbs. The storyteller has replaced the philosopher. The influencer has replaced the scholar, and the crowd worships them because they make them feel. This is the empire of emotion, vast, loud, and unyielding. In it, reason is exiled, skepticism is condemned, and calm reflection is seen as weakness. To think slowly, to doubt, to analyze. These are crimes against the modern religion of feeling. You are told to trust your heart, but never your mind. You are told that passion is authenticity, and that to feel deeply is to be wise. Yet history shows that emotion, without reason, builds no empires, it destroys them. Look at the revolutions that consumed their own children, the movements that began with justice and ended in madness. All began with righteous emotion, outrage, pain, hope, but without reason to temper them. They turned into beasts that devoured the very people who fed them. The fire that was meant to warm became the inferno that burned the house down. And still, man never learns, because it is easier to feel than to think, easier to burn than to build. When emotion rules, the crowd becomes dangerous. The individual dissolves into the collective frenzy. Logic cannot penetrate the noise of hysteria. The man who speaks calmly is drowned by those who scream. And when all that remains is feeling, truth itself becomes subjective. It bends and twists according to the emotion of the moment. One day the crowd worships you, the next it destroys you. What remains constant is not truth but volatility. And power thrives in volatility. The most cunning rulers do not suppress emotion. They weaponize it. They feed it. They whisper to the crowd's fear, flatter its pride, provoke its outrage. Then they watch as the people, convinced they are fighting for truth, unknowingly serve the very systems that control them. It is not by accident that your world feels perpetually divided. Division keeps emotion alive, and emotion keeps reason asleep. There was a time when a man's greatness was measured by his mastery over himself, his ability to control his temper, to discipline his mind, to rise above his passions. But in your age, the opposite is praised. The man who feels the most, who reacts the loudest, who expresses without restraint. He is celebrated as authentic. Yet authenticity without discipline is chaos. It is the undoing of civilization disguised as honesty. You see, emotion is seductive. It makes people believe they are alive, engaged, righteous. But it is a trap. It offers certainty without understanding, satisfaction without truth. Once a man begins to trust his emotions more than his judgment, he becomes easy to manipulate. He can be turned against his neighbor, his friend, even himself, simply by the right appeal to fear or pride. And when an entire society lives in this state, reacting, raging, feeling, it becomes impossible to govern with reason. Debate turns to warfare. Ideas turn to identity. Every disagreement becomes a moral crusade. The people, once capable of dialogue, now only know how to destroy. And through their destruction, those in power remain untouched, smiling behind the curtain, for they know that the mind divided by emotion is a mind conquered. The empire of emotion over logic is not sustained by violence, but by seduction. It whispers to the human need for belonging, for validation, for importance. It tells the man, you are right because you feel deeply. And so, he stops examining whether what he feels is true. He becomes proud of his ignorance, blind to his manipulation, and hostile to anyone who dares bring reason into his temple of feelings. Emotion is not evil. It is powerful, necessary, even beautiful when guided by reason. But when emotion becomes the master and logic its slave, the mind becomes a battlefield where truth cannot survive. And in that battlefield, the one who rules is not the man who is right, but the one who can make others feel that he is. In my time, knowledge was a weapon, forged in silence, sharpened by discipline, and wielded by the few who dared to seek truth for themselves. Education was not meant to comfort you. It was meant to disturb you. It stripped away illusion and exposed the cold mechanics of power, faith, and human folly. But now the very thing that was once meant to awaken the mind has become the tool that puts it to sleep. Education has been corrupted, not by ignorance, but by design. Once the scholar sought truth. He pursued wisdom not for applause, but for understanding. The pursuit of knowledge was an act of rebellion, an act of courage. To learn was to stand apart from the herd. But now education no longer challenges, it conforms. It no longer shapes thinkers. It manufactures followers. The modern student does not enter the classroom to discover how to think. He enters to be told what to think. And once he accepts this, his intellect dies before it ever truly awakens. You see, the corruption of education is not in its failure to teach facts, but in its success at teaching obedience. It trains the mind not to question authority, but to submit to it. It rewards those who repeat and punishes those who doubt. It tells you that wisdom is found in memorizing answers, not in asking dangerous questions. And when an entire generation is taught this way, you create not citizens, but servants. The rulers of your world have discovered something far more effective than censorship. Indoctrination disguised as learning. They do not need to burn books when they can rewrite them. They do not need to silence thinkers when they can train them to think only within permitted boundaries. And so, the modern man grows up believing he is educated, when in truth, he has merely been programmed. He carries his ignorance like a badge of honor, because it has been stamped with the seal of authority. When the pursuit of truth becomes a path of conformity, knowledge loses its soul. It becomes sterile, lifeless, reduced to numbers, credentials, and certificates. Your world worships titles more than intellect. You respect the degree, not the depth of thought. You bow to institutions as if wisdom were their property. But wisdom has never lived in buildings of marble or within printed diplomas. It lives in the restless mind, the one that doubts, questions, and dares to defy. The irony is that you live in the most informed era in human history, yet wisdom has never been more scarce. Information floods your world like an ocean, yet the human mind is drowning in it. Everyone knows everything, and yet no one understands anything. Knowledge has become abundance without comprehension, consumption without digestion. The mind, once trained to think, is now trained to absorb. And when people absorb without reflection, they become vessels, full but empty, loud but hollow. Education has become a marketplace, not a monastery. It sells illusions, not enlightenment. Students are customers, teachers are clerks, and knowledge is a product to be consumed, not a mystery to be explored. The goal is no longer wisdom, but employability, not mastery, but compliance. The system does not ask, what is true? It asks, what will make you useful? And the moment knowledge becomes a tool for utility alone, it loses its power to liberate. When I wrote of power, I warned that a ruler must always manage perception, that truth, when dangerous, should be hidden. It seems your world has taken this advice too well. They have built systems that teach not how to uncover truth, but how to accept narratives. The modern scholar reads 1,000 pages and still knows nothing of himself. He can quote philosophers but cannot reason like one. He can recite theories but cannot challenge them. He confuses data with wisdom, speed with understanding, and recognition with intelligence. The corruption runs deeper still. Education, once the great equalizer, has become the great divider. It no longer elevates the poor mind to freedom. It binds it to dependency. The man who cannot afford it is excluded from opportunity. The man who can afford it is indoctrinated into arrogance. One becomes resentful, the other obedient. Both are slaves of the same system, wearing different chains. And what of the teachers? They too have been captured. Once, a teacher was a philosopher, a torchbearer of light in the darkness. Now, he is a performer, constrained by rules, measurements, and bureaucracy. He teaches not truth, but curriculum. He grades not thought, but conformity. If he dares to deviate, If he dares to inspire rebellion of the mind, he is silenced. For in your age, the greatest crime in education is not ignorance, it is independence. Think about how easily the mind of a child is molded. The young mind does not resist, it absorbs. What you plant there grows for a lifetime. Those who control education do not shape the present, they command the future. This is why rulers care so deeply about what is taught, and more importantly, how it is taught. To teach a child what to think is to create a subject. To teach a child how to think is to create a threat. And so, the system chooses safety over freedom, control over enlightenment. You live in a world that worships information but fears wisdom. Wisdom cannot be controlled, it questions everything. It disrupts systems, it undermines authority, and so wisdom has been quietly exiled. It has been replaced by expertise, specialized knowledge that serves the system but never challenges it. The expert knows everything about one small thing and nothing about the truth of the whole. This is not wisdom, it is intellectual slavery wrapped in prestige. The corruption of knowledge is complete when people mistake familiarity for understanding. They believe they know the world because they have studied it through screens and slogans. They confuse exposure with experience, literacy with insight. The modern mind no longer reads to discover, it reads to agree. It seeks confirmation, not transformation. And the moment knowledge becomes comfortable, it stops being knowledge at all. The saddest consequence of this corruption is that man no longer hungers for truth. He hungers for validation. He does not wish to know, he wishes to be right. Education has trained him not to explore ideas, but to defend them like sacred relics. The scholar of today no longer builds new wisdom, he protects old dogma. And so, even as the libraries grow and the data multiplies, the human mind shrinks. The flame of inquiry that once burned in the hearts of men like Socrates, Da Vinci, and Galileo now flickers weakly in a generation raised to obey its screens. Knowledge, once a sword that divided illusion from reality, has been dulled by comfort. The mind, once an arena of intellectual combat, has become a theater of repetition. The pursuit of truth, once the noblest ambition, has become a dangerous game few are brave enough to play. The corruption of education and knowledge is not the end of intelligence, but the domestication of it. The people are still clever, still informed, but their cleverness serves the system, not themselves. Their intelligence has been trained to build cages, not to break them. There was a time when the mind of one man could change the course of history. A philosopher with a pen, a strategist with an idea, a thinker who refused to bow before the crowd. These were the men who shaped civilization. But that age has ended. Today, the crowd rules. And when the crowd rules, truth becomes fragile, reason becomes dangerous, and courage becomes extinct. You live in a time where the crowd does not follow leaders, it devours them. It worships the majority, not because the majority is right, but because it is loud. The measure of truth has shifted. It is no longer about what is logical or just, but about what is popular. The crowd does not think, it reacts. It does not analyze, it consumes. It does not seek truth, it seeks satisfaction. And in this restless pursuit of comfort and validation, the mind, the very instrument of freedom, begins to rot in silence. The rise of the crowd is the greatest transformation of power in human history. It has replaced kings, dethroned philosophers, and silenced prophets. Once the crowd feared the wise man. Now the wise man fears the crowd. He knows that reason cannot win against emotion multiplied by millions. He knows that in the court of public opinion, evidence is irrelevant and perception is law. And so the thinker retreats, not because he lacks courage, but because he understands that speaking truth in an age of madness is to invite destruction. The crowd, my friend, is a beast with many heads and no mind. Each head believes itself intelligent, yet none can see the whole. It is driven by instinct, by fear, by envy, and by the hunger to belong. When one head howls, the others follow, and soon the noise becomes a doctrine. The louder it grows, the truer it feels. The modern world calls this democracy of thought. But I tell you, it is the tyranny of emotion. Observe how truth is now decided. It is not proven, it is voted on. A million voices shouting in unison can turn a lie into a law. The crowd rewards those who feed its desires and crucifies those who challenge them. The clever ones have learned this game well. They do not lead the crowd. They flatter it. They whisper what it wants to hear, ignite its anger, amplify its fears. And while the people cheer, believing themselves empowered, they are merely being steered. You see, the crowd is powerful but blind. It destroys what it cannot understand and worships what it cannot question. It believes it thinks, but it only feels. It believes it chooses, but it only reacts. The rulers of today need not command armies, they command emotions. They know that logic cannot move the masses, only spectacle can. Give the people a villain, and they will follow you into chaos. Give them an illusion, and they will defend it as truth. The crowd does not seek leaders who tell them reality. It seeks entertainers who mirror their desires. The fall of the mind begins when men start mistaking noise for knowledge. The digital square you call the internet has become the new Colosseum, where the mob gathers not to learn but to tear apart. They do not argue to find truth. They argue to destroy opponents. The louder the rage, the greater the victory. The more emotion displayed, the more validation received. It is not wisdom that gains applause, but fury. Not truth that wins followers, but passion. And so, every conversation becomes a battle, every disagreement a war. The individual, once the guardian of reason, now disappears into the collective fog. He no longer asks, "Is this true?" He asks, "What do others believe?" He no longer thinks, "What is right?" but "What will keep me accepted?" In this way, the mind becomes hostage to the collective. The need for belonging outweighs the need for truth. And when the crowd becomes God, conscience becomes its first sacrifice. You may believe that your opinions are your own, but they are not. They are shaped, sculpted, and sold to you by unseen architects. Every belief you hold has been tested, refined, and packaged for mass consumption. The crowd thinks it is rebelling against power. Yet every act of rebellion has already been predicted and monetized. Even your outrage serves someone's purpose. Even your dissent fuels someone's profit. In this empire of the crowd, manipulation no longer feels like oppression. It feels like participation. The most dangerous illusion of this era is that collective agreement equals truth. It never has. It never will. The truth has always been the property of the few. The ones who are willing to think when everyone else obeys. But the crowd fears such people. It senses their independence and calls it arrogance. It mistakes their silence for weakness. Yet those who stand apart from the mob are not weak. They are the last remnants of human reason in an age of noise. The fall of the mind does not happen with violence. It happens with applause. The crowd cheers for its own chains, celebrating conformity as virtue and calling it unity. They say, "We all agree," as if agreement were proof of wisdom. They say, "We all feel this way," as if emotion were evidence of truth. And thus the crowd becomes its own ruler and its own victim. It punishes deviation not because it is wrong, but because it is different. Every tyrant understands this principle, that fear of isolation is more powerful than fear of death. Men will betray truth before they risk being outcast. They will silence their conscience to protect their comfort. They will kneel before the crowd to avoid standing alone. And once this fear takes hold, reason becomes irrelevant. Because to think differently is to suffer, and no one wants to suffer. The rise of the crowd is not the rise of democracy, but the fall of discernment. It gives everyone a voice but teaches no one to listen. It gives everyone opinions but denies them understanding. It gives everyone visibility but strips them of individuality. The more connected men become, the less they know themselves. They trade their solitude, that sacred space where thought is born, for the comfort of noise. And in doing so, they lose the very thing that made them human, the ability to think freely. What is most tragic is that the crowd believes it is awake. It mocks the idea of manipulation, laughs at the notion of control. But what it calls awareness is only another illusion. Another layer of deception designed to make obedience feel like rebellion. The crowd marches proudly under banners of freedom, never realizing that the slogans they chant were written by the very hands they claim to oppose. The fall of the mind and the rise of the crowd mark the perfect victory for those who rule. For what ruler could ask for more than a people who demand their own enslavement and call it liberty? When truth becomes a matter of popularity, the manipulators of perception become the true kings, and while the masses shout, argue, and destroy one another in pursuit of false righteousness, the real power sits silently above them, untouched, unseen, and amused. If you wish to see the truth, you must first be willing to stand alone. Because the crowd does not seek truth, it seeks comfort, and the man who dares to think becomes its enemy. So tell me, my friend, do you still believe you are thinking for yourself? Or has the crowd already done it for you?